Good morning, comrades. Try to bear with me here. I've never given a talk this early in the morning before. To reduce the legacy of the October Revolution to a victory of labor over capital, to peasant over landlord, is to overlook one of its greatest achievements. Perhaps even more important than those magnificent triumphs was the triumph of colonized over colonizer. The Bolshevik Revolution was the greatest anti-colonial revolution up to that point in history, in terms of both scale and accomplishments. The revolution transformed the prison house of nations, an empire where the oppressed nations were flagrantly denied fundamental rights, into a union of equals where every people could develop and prosper along their own path. Pivotal to this development was the Soviet of Nationalities, a wing of their bicameral legislature that granted equal representation to every nation. Imagine the kind of progress this tool could unleash on a country such as ours, where we still live under the yoke of a slave master's constitution. The first leader of the Soviet Union following Lenin's death, Joseph Stalin, was formerly People's Commissar for Nationalities. This put him in charge of ensuring the right of oppressed nations to self-determination within the revolutionary society. Stalin was a Georgian from a very poor background, and Georgia was one of the oppressed nations within the Russian Empire. 1 month after the revolution, Stalin wrote the Appeal to the Muslims of Russia and the East, calling on Muslim people to find common cause with the revolution and unite against colonialism. Many other leaders of the revolution came from oppressed nationalities, such as the founder of the Red Army, Leon Trotsky, who was Jewish. The tremendous battle against colonialism waged by the revolution spread far beyond the borders of the Soviet Union. In one of the first acts of the revolution, the Bolsheviks called for a just and democratic peace to end the First World War. They addressed this statement primarily to the peoples of the warring countries, calling for all sides to respect the self-determination of all peoples. The revolution continued to expose the imperialists by publicizing secret treaties they had written. This included the Sykes-Picot Agreement, a conspiracy between the French and British empires to divide West Asia between them. The Soviet Union grew into a center of organizing and support for people fighting colonialism around the planet. Through offering solidarity with education, diplomacy, trade, training, and arms, the USSR became the midwife to an era of national liberation. The solidarity and the geopolitical counterbalance offered by the USSR benefited many struggles that weren't Marxist-Leninist or even opposed to the USSR. The movements, states, and victories of this era were just as much gains of the October Revolution as the progress made within the territory of the USSR. Their fates were inextricably linked, something we saw clearly after the counter-revolution in the Soviet Union. On the heels of the counter-revolution, the imperialist bourgeoisie, led by the United States, began the most genocidal colonial campaign since the 19th century. No corner of earth was spared its wrath. Under the ridiculous pretext of such utter nonsense as a war on terrorism, humanitarian intervention, and regime change, the imperialists marched forward on a scorched earth offensive. Entire regions were stocked with occupation forces, and whole states were liquidated. New bourgeois terminology, such as failed states, came into being as a means of explaining away the massive destruction. In West Asia, a new Sykes-Picot was in development. Contrary to the popular notion that the war against Iraq, the war on terrorism, and the destruction of Libya were failures, these wars and their so-called failed states were a long-contrived means to redivide the region. Each war fed into another. Counter-revolution against the remnants of national liberation was consciously fomented within the destruction. The strategy culminated in the completely genocidal war against Syria. Syria is and was the most powerful bastion against imperialism in the Arab world. It was a longtime ally of the Soviet Union, and the very foundations of its society are pluralism, secularism, pan-Arabism, Arab socialism, and independence. Syria consistently defended Palestine with diplomatic and material support. Part of its land has been occupied by Zionists for over 40 years, but they have never made peace with them. It was key to facilitating the axis of resistance, an alliance between anti-imperialist forces in West Asia. All these factors made Syria the biggest obstacle to imperialist plans for a new Sykes-Picot. The imperialists invaded Syria, utilizing counter-revolutionaries they had been fostering for decades. Forces such as Al-Qaeda and the so-called Islamic State were directly created, funded, supported, and directed by U.S. imperialism to liquidate Syrian society. The U.S. and their allies hoped they could weaken Syria enough to come to the aid of the counter-revolutionaries like they had in Libya. Pressure from the masses and other world powers such as Russia was great enough to avoid this disaster. The imperialists increased their support for the various death squads in the country and used them as a pretext, as they have in many other places, to begin bombing and sending soldiers. Their bombing campaign worked in tandem with the Contra forces, destroying more of Syria every day. Did the Syrian people or the state they had labored so hard to maintain make any concessions in a vain hope of easing the pressure? No, they did the opposite. The new Constitution of 2012 doubled down on their core principles. Part of the preamble reads, "Syria has occupied an important position as it is the beating heart of Arabism, the forefront of confrontation with the Zionist enemy, and the bedrock of resistance against colonial hegemony on the Arab world and its capabilities and wealth." This understanding lives in the hearts of the Syrian people. They fought for decades against imperialist-sponsored reaction to maintain the culture, unity, and prosperity of their people and the peoples of the Arab world. That is why Syria today stands near complete victory over counter-revolutionary forces. We should give them a hand. That isn't to say that Syria's allies weren't instrumental. The solidarity of the axis of resistance, Hezbollah and the Islamic Republic of Iran, has been imperative. We can't deny the importance of Russia's support either. Russia's support has a dual character, the most obvious being Syria is Russia's only ally in the Middle East and their direct access to the Mediterranean Sea. The other is the fact that the success of a new Sykes-Picot and the transformation of Syria into a breeding ground of reaction would have catastrophic consequences even the imperialists can't foresee. Imperialism is in a struggle to the death against contraction, and that is why it must expand. This expansion is becoming so destructive and volatile that even capitalist countries like Russia must begrudgingly confront it or be consumed. The near victory of Syria over imperialism is the greatest victory of the oppressed in decades. The foundation of modern imperialism is a momentum built through destruction. The Syrian people and their allies halted this momentum in a region at the core of their strategy. You can see the imperialist devastation and bewilderment in their orientation towards the region. Ceaseless threats pour over Iran every day. The landmark nuclear deal they negotiated against genocidal sanctions imposed on them is being threatened by a furious United States. In the midst of unprecedented internal chaos, Saudi Arabia kidnapped the Prime Minister of Lebanon and has declared war on the entire country. This effectively pushes the Lebanese state apparatus and society to further embrace the resistance axis. At the same time, Riyadh is threatened by missiles from the revolutionaries in Yemen they have failed to crush. Imperialism isn't only being hindered by arms struggle. Socialist China has fought imperialism by building infrastructure and investing in oppressed nations. Nearly all continents have benefited from socialism with Chinese characteristics. China's policy contradicts the development, austerity, dependence, and destruction imperialism sows to maintain profit. Imperialism is on the ropes. For the first time since the socialist bloc was destroyed, the correlation of forces is shifting, and the imperialist superstructure is losing coherence. This isn't to say the struggle will be easy from here, or that it will collapse in on itself. An enemy that feels like it has nothing to lose is an extremely dangerous and volatile one. This is illustrated clearly by the countless threats pouring from Washington this year. Nearly every day, a different country is threatened in the most crass way with annihilation. The loss of strategic conflicts and its own internal contradictions leave the future uncertain. We must be prepared for the desperate measures that will be taken in a desperate attempt to recoup losses in West Asia and elsewhere. We have to capitalize on the victories our comrades around the world have won for us. We may be at different barricades, but we are all in the same struggle to the death against imperialism. We must be prepared to defend our allies around the world at all costs. The battle cry of Lenin lives on in our struggle today. Workers and oppressed people of the world, unite!